Let me tell you just briefly about a guy named George Mueller. He's one of the greatest missionaries ever, more orphanages than any missionary. He was a horrible sinner until he was 30 years old. And when he was 30 years old, he went to what we would call a life group, a small group, about 6 or 7 people in a Bible study in a home, and accepted the Lord, gave his life to the Lord when he's 30. Just to let you give you a little background, he was studying to be in the ministry and still living this horrible, sinful life. But the reason he was studying to be in the ministry, because the ministry at that time in the country he lived was, the ministers were employees of the government, and they had a good life, and so he thought this would be security for me. But he was a horrible sinner studying for the ministry for the benefits of it. So he gets saved when he's 30, and he decides, I'm going to missionary school. He believes God called him to missionary school. He goes to his father, and his father said, I'm not going to send you to missionary school. And his father had the means to send him. And so he prayed. He prayed for 2 months. 2 months. At the end of that 2 months, the Lord said to him, now go. So he went and he got in line to register for missionary school, and he had to pay his tuition. And while he was standing in line, a man walked up to him and put some money in his pocket. And when he got to the window, he put his money out, and it was enough to pay his tuition. He then completed missionary school, and he went to the missions board for them to send him as a missionary, and they declined him, even though he completed school, because of his past life. You were too bad of a sinner, so you can't be that good of a missionary now. So what did he do? He prayed for 1 year. And then God said to him, now go. So he goes to the country where God called him. He goes, he prays, and God tells him to go to a certain town. He goes to the town, and he sees a church. He walks up to the church. He says, I'd like to talk to the pastor. They said, well, the pastor resigned last week. He said, well, I just completed missionary school. They said, you're hired. He became the pastor of that church. He also, in a few months, he found out how the church was being supported. It was being supported because wealthy members were renting pews. They were renting the good seats. So they're sitting in the good seats, and he finds out about it, so he preaches a message and says, this isn't right. We're not going to show partiality. And he said, from now on, we're going to tithe and give the way the Bible says to. And this, I was interested when I read this, he said, we're not going to pass the plate anymore. We're going to put offering boxes by the doors. I personally thought I invented that. This was in the 1800s. They put offering boxes by the door. God began to bless. Then God said to him, do something about the children. So he began to pray, and he started an orphanage. He started another one. All he did was pray. He had more orphanages than any other missionary. Thousands of children. In the 1800s, in 30 years of ministry, in that time, their missions fund, not just the church tithe, the missions fund, they brought in $7.5 million. And all he did was pray. And then when he was 93 years old and 8 months, he's been saved 63 years and 8 months. He was just about to pass away, and the friend that was taking care of him heard him praying, and he called the name of a man that had been his best friend when he was 30 years old, when he'd gotten saved. And that man had turned his back on God and said, I'm not accepting Christ, and had never accepted Christ. And George Mueller's calling his name 63 years and 8 months later. And the friend said to him later, did you pray for this guy that's turned away from God all these years? And George Mueller said, I've prayed for him every day. Every day since I accepted Christ. And a few days later, he passed away. And at his funeral, the friend that had heard him pray was there. And he looked up and he saw the friend that he had prayed for come to the service. And at the end of the service, the man that he had prayed for walked up to his grave, got on his knees, and gave his life to Jesus Christ. Because God answers prayer.